Okay. Hi everyone. Please turn your cameras on so that we can start. Anyway, I see a very small group here, so it'll be nice if all of you can turn your cameras on. It'll be good for our interaction, and I'll also see and understand if you're following or not. Okay, so welcome to the first class of our crash course, and I have already sent the schedule and timetable on the WhatsApp group. From there, you can get a brief idea as to which topic we're gonna cover in which order and how many days we're gonna spend behind each topic. So it's sort of flexible, and we are also open to modifying it depending upon how the pace of our syllabus goes. So, a very important thing that I want to make clear from the beginning is that since this is a crash course, we will not be able to go into a lot of depth as we go into our master's entrance preparation full course. So that's why, because we have to complete the syllabus in 30 days, we will be focusing on the most important topics from each chapter. And we would also require you to review the PPTs and the notes and the study material that we send in advance so that you can have some basic understanding before we begin. Then only the class content is going to make sense to you. So I want to hear from the class. If you have reviewed the stats PPT, then please raise your hand. And reviewing doesn't mean that you saw it, you scrolled the screen, scrolled through the slides for 1 or 2 minutes. I'm talking about spending good amount of 15-20 minutes in properly seeing what is there. How many of you have done that? I see only Rashi's hand. Okay, Rashi, Priyanshi, Prabjot, Namya, Purva, Rushmita, Khushi, Stuti. Okay, so only 8 people out of 42 of you. Sanjana also great. So only 9 people. Sharvi, okay, great. Only 10 people out of 45 people here. That's like 1/4 of the class strength, which is very less. And I understand that you may be having a lot on your plate, college internals, exams, attendance, all of that. But if you want to complete the syllabus in 30 days, if you want to make the most out of this course, then you have to revise and at least review the material. It just takes 15 to 20 minutes. You have to do that. And if you don't do that, then you will not really understand what I'm explaining, right? So I hope that from next class, all of you are going to review the material because without that, it is honestly your loss. And I don't want that. We are taking out our time every single day. We keep on editing the PPTs the whole day. Every day we have classes. So if we are giving our best so that you can make the most out of it, then you should also take at least 15-20 minutes. It is for your benefit. We are not getting anything. It's for you. So please make sure it's done from next time. Okay, so let's start with stats and research. So we start by understanding what exactly is statistics, what exactly is research, what comes under both of them, and what topics can we get to study and expect under stats and research. So basically, in psychology, there is a lot of data around us, right? If you talk about some psychological variables such as IQ scores, or if you talk about scores of aggression, scores of extroversion, scores of introversion, there's so much data around us. So, what do you do with that data? You want to present that data in some way, right? So how will you present that? You will present that data with the help of statistics only. Without statistics, how will you make sense of numbers? So statistics is something that helps you collect your data, to organize your data, to analyze your data, and to interpret your data so that you can make some sense out of it, so that you can draw some conclusions out of it. So basically, stats can be divided into two main parts. The first part is descriptive stats, and the other one is inferential stats. The things that I'm highlighting with yellow are your very important keywords, and you have to write those in your notebook. So, what is the difference between descriptive stats and inferential stats? So, as the word suggests, descriptive. Descriptive means to describe your data, to organize your data, to summarize your data. So, for example, if I'm saying that in a particular class, Can you tell me how is the class performance like for a maths test? So if the teacher is going to create a bar graph, if the teacher is going to create a histogram, or if the teacher is going to create a pie chart or a frequency distribution table, then for the purpose of summarizing the data, organizing the data, descriptive stats will be used. Descriptive stats will only tell you about the summary of the data so that you can just see it at a glance and understand what the trend is like. But on the other hand, sometimes you want to do some experiments so that you can draw some conclusion out of it. You want to draw some inferences. Whenever your research is about drawing conclusions or about making inferences about any data, then what do we use? We use inferential stats. So all your t-test, all your ANOVA, all your chi-square, all of that is helpful for drawing conclusions. That will come under inferential statistics. And the rest of the topics under stats that we are going to study in this PPT would be measures of central tendency, measures of dispersion, correlation, and graphical representation. And all of this is a part of descriptive stats because all of these are used to describe your data. On the other hand, when it comes to drawing out conclusions and inferences, then what is required? Parametric test, non-parametric test, correlation, t-test, z-test, ANOVA, chi-square, p-value, effect size, level of significance. These are required for drawing conclusions and inferences. So you can call this a table of contents type of a slide also because it gives you a briefer as to what we're gonna be doing. So that's about stats. This is about the numerical part. But when it comes to the theory part, the methodology part, that is where research comes into the picture. So research is a systematic, scientific, and organized process in which you can collect your data, you can analyze your data, and you can interpret your data to solve problems and get the solutions to your questions. So, as I said, this is more involved with the methodology part, the theory part. So, research is helpful in generating new knowledge, in verifying the theories that are currently existing, modifying the theories that are currently existing, updating them, or finding solutions of different problems. And what topics are we gonna study under research? We'll be studying the types of research, the methods of research, which is mainly your qualitative versus quantitative research that we'll be doing in depth. Then what all comes under research? Research problem, hypothesis, errors, types of variables, sampling and its types, research designs, the different methods of data collection, all of that we will be doing. Okay, so this is just like a briefer as to what you can expect in this stats crash course. Now let's start with the first topic of today's class, which is variables. Now variables, as you hear the word variables, do you hear the word vary in variables? So to understand what variables are, let's focus on the word vary. Vary is something that is free to change, that is free to be different across people, different situations, across different times, right? So that's exactly what is the meaning of variable. Variable is like a trait or a characteristic or a condition in a particular research which can vary across individuals, situations, or times. And a very important thing about variables in research is that it is measurable. So all variables, they can be measured, and that's extremely important. That also brings us to operational definition, which I'll tell you at the end of this slide. So you've understood variables are things that can vary in research. Okay, now there are different types of variables. The first variable is called the independent variable, and this is the variable that is manipulated or controlled by the researcher. Now, why is it manipulated? The reason for manipulating the IV is so that you can understand if there is any change in the dependent variable as a result of IV's manipulation. All right, so I'll give you an example. I give this example in every class. So let's say we're trying to understand the effect of caffeine on sleep. We're trying to understand the effect of caffeine on sleep. So tell me that which one out of these variables you can manipulate. Manipulate as in which one of these can you change? let's say um, this is a factor which you can make different from different groups to different people. Yes, you are right. Caffeine intake is something that you can manipulate. So maybe one group will get 5 glasses of caffeine, coffee, other group will get 10 glasses, one of the groups will not get any glass of caffeine, right? And which one of these is the one that you're going to measure? You will make them sleep for a week, you'll consecutively measure how their sleep is going to be. So, which one of these variables are you going to measure? Write in the chat box. Which one of this can you measure? Yes, you will be measuring sleep. Exactly. So that explains IV and DV. So IV is the variable which is manipulated and controlled, and DV is the variable which is measured later. Why is it measured? So that you can understand if IV has had an effect on the DV. And because this is the one which is checked for later, if there is any result or not, it is also called the outcome variable, and IV is also known as the cause variable. So IV also called cause variable, DV also called outcome variable. Okay, now there are some subtypes of IV also, and those subtypes are known as active IV and attribute IV. The other name for this is active IV is also called type E IV, and your attribute IV is also called type S IV. This is just another synonym of that. All of this is given in the PPT. Now we have already understood that IV is something that can be manipulated. Okay. Now, some of the IVs are the ones which you can very easily, very simply, very nicely, you can manipulate it without any problem. For example, the amount of drug that you want to give to someone. To one person, you can give 5 mg drug. To other person, you can give 10 mg drug. Or maybe the amount of caffeine, 1 glass, 5 glass, 10 glass. Or maybe the type of therapy modality. To one person, you give CBT, other person, you give DBT, third person, you give EFT, anything. This is something you can very easily, very directly manipulate without any problem. But there are some other variables also which you cannot manipulate. For example, the gender of a person, the age of a person, the ethnicity of a person, right? The culture of a person, right? So if you need females in your study and you have only available males, can you change the biological sex of the male participant just because you need female participants in your study? Can you do that? Yes or no? Yes, of course, you cannot do that, right? So, what will you do instead? You will not take the male participants and you will only select the female participants. So, this is what is known as attribute IV type S. Type S just means selecting. Type S, S for selection. So, these are very pre-existing qualities of your participants and they cannot be manipulated. Let's say you need 10-year-old participants in your study, but you only have 30-year-old people around you. You cannot make them 10 years old now. So you will not take them at all. Rather, you will just select 10-year-old students from schools or playgrounds. You'll find it like that. So this is all about IV and this is all about DV. Now, IV and DV are like the main variables in our study, but along with that, there is a third one also called an extraneous variable. And the extraneous variable often causes a lot of problem to us because it has the potential of affecting the IV. Sorry, it has the potential of affecting the DV, slip of tongue. It has the potential of affecting the DV very unintentionally. In a good study, which has high internal validity, we only want the IV to bring changes in the DV, but sometimes a variable other than the IV, which can affect the DV, is known as the extraneous variable. And our goal is to minimize them and control them as much as possible so that we can say that our study has high internal validity. There are 3 types of extraneous variables: situational, participant, and experimental. Situational are the ones which come from the situation, which come from the environment. For example, during your experiment, there was a lot of noise, so the participants got distracted, hence, they could not recall the memory test. So, that is something from the environment that affected the DB memory recall, right? So, we don't want there, we want it to be controlled. Then, let's say on that day it was very hot, so a lot of humidity, temperature. All those things are situational. Then there are participant extraneous variables also, which are the qualities of the participant, like the individual differences of the participant. Let's say on that day, the person did not sleep well, or they were having anxiety because of something. So their lack of sleep and their anxiety is going to have an impact on the DV, right? So that is participant variables. Thirdly, there are experimenter extraneous variables, which can include the bias of the experimenter, or the way how the experimenter conducts the experiment, or the instructions that they give. There has to be uniformity in that, right? Let's say the experimenter is giving the different instructions to different groups, so that is going to create some difference, right? We don't want this. So that's why our goal is to control extraneous variables as much as possible. Now, when you try to control all those outer variables, the ones that you are very successfully in controlling, they become your control variables. So variables that are kept constant, or variables that are controlled so that they are not affecting the DV, they are known as control variables. For example, if I want to do a CBT intervention on people who have anxiety to figure out if CBT is a good treatment for reducing anxiety, then the different kind of control variables that I can use are, let's say that I will be using the same therapist for every session, and I will be taking the same days for every session, Monday, 7 p.m. every week, so that there is some constancy, so that there is some control. All right. And the session duration also should be the same. Every session should be of 1 hour. The session should be offline every time. It cannot be online in between, otherwise it can create distractions and other problems, right? So control variables are all those variables which are kept constant or controlled to prevent interference with the DV. But unfortunately, we are not able to control each and everything, right? Because we don't always have access to labs. And even if you work in labs, one or two things will be left, which will ultimately bring some error, which will affect the DV in a way that you don't want. And those variables are known as confounding variables. So confounding variable is a type of extraneous variable which has affected the DV, right? And as a result of that, it is very difficult for us to understand that is the change in DV has been brought because of the IV, or has it come because of the confounding variable or something else? So now when the effect has already happened, we didn't want it, but it has happened. We tried to control as much as possible, but it has still happened. Then that is known as confounding variable. All right. Now these were the ones that were quite important. Now there are two extra variables. I'll tell you this is extra, all right, so that you can prioritize it accordingly. They are known as mediating and moderating variables. Mediating variable is also known as intervening variable. Intervening, what does it mean to intervene? Let's say that two people are there, right? And you are going and you're intervening between them, which means that you have come between them. Intervening means that this intervening variable tries to explain how is the IV having an impact on the DV. So if I am saying that caffeine intake increases one's attention and focus, right? So there must be something happening between caffeine intake and focus. There must be something happening between it, right? Let's say that caffeine is a stimulant, so it increases your central nervous system functioning. So this is something which is coming in between. This is something which is intervening, right? So activation of the central nervous system, we can say, is a intervening variable. It is a mediating variable that explains how is IV causing a change in DV. How is caffeine causing an increase in focus? Because of activation of central nervous system. That is a mediating variable. Now what about the moderating variable? It is something else. So basically, moderating variable is again something that comes in between, but it sort of moderates it. Moderates as in, I'll try to give you another example. So let's say here we have stress And we also have stress leading to anxiety, let's say. But in between, let's say your moderating variable is social support. So tell me that if your social support is more, then what will happen to anxiety? Will it increase or will it decrease? If social support is more, then what will happen to anxiety? Yes, anxiety will decrease. And vice versa. If social support is less, then stress-induced anxiety can also be more. So that is the meaning of moderating variable. Basically, the more or the less the social support is. Similarly, social support can have its impact on the anxiety. So more or less, and that will explain the strength or the direction of the relationship between IV and DV. All right, so these are your most important variables. Lastly, continuous and discrete is very, very simple. Basically, if I say that how many houses do you have? People will say, I have one house, I have two houses. How many cars do you have? I have two cars. How many people live in your family? Five people live in my family. Right, so these very whole numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or maybe 0, these are your fixed values, these are your discrete variables. But on the other hand, if I ask you that, let's say, what is your temperature? You'll say 98.6. I'll ask you, what is your weight? You will say 60.2. I'll ask you, what is your height? You will say 5'8". So you do see there are decimals in between it. This is a quantity that can be expressed in fractions. And within fractions, it can take any range. Talk about temperature. Temperature can not just be 100 or 102. It can also be between these values, right? 100.0001, 100.01, 101.001, 101.02. It can take so many values. So that is known as a continuous variable. So with this, we are done with the types of variables. And as I said that, I will tell you the meaning of operational definition. So basically, see, variables can be a very abstract concept sometimes. And to make it more concrete, to make it more measurable, we need an operational definition. For example, if I am saying that I want to measure anxiety in my participants, so how are you going to measure anxiety? You have to define anxiety first. So while writing an operational definition, I will say that to operationalize anxiety, maybe I will use a scale, which is the state rate anxiety inventory. Basically, it's a psychometric tool that is created to assess the level of anxiety that people face. So I will be using the STAI, state rate anxiety inventory, and the kind of scores that people are getting on that, it will help me to categorize their level of anxiety, whether it is moderate, whether it is severe, or it is low. So this is how you can concretize an abstract concept like anxiety and make it into more specific and more measurable terms. So you can make it more observable and you can make it more quantifiable. Okay. So we are done with variables in research. Now we are going to the next slide. Just do a thumbs up if you have understood everything here, and questions will be all taken at the end of the class. You can do a thumbs up if you are with me. Okay, if you have any questions, just write it in your notebook and I will take it after the class ends so that we are able to follow up with the pace. Okay. So now we are moving to another topic called the research problem or the problem statement. So basically, whenever someone is doing a research, then every research starts with some kind of problem, right? I'll give you example of my um, dissertation when I was doing my master's. So I had done research on perfectionism in students preparing for competitive exams, because I was seeing at that time when I was teaching that most of the students are very highly perfectionists and they have this thing that they want to score highest marks, and if they don't do that, they have some fear of failure, right? And they just set very high expectations on themselves, all of that. So because I noticed that there is such a big problem, it is causing anxiety in students, it's interfering with their work-life balance. It is giving them so much stress. So there is a problem. So I did a research, I did an intervention to reduce perfectionism in them. So that was a solution that I tried to find. So the point here is that every research starts with a problem which you want to solve or you want to find more about. So research problem is the basic issue or question that the study seeks to address. It can be any problem in your environment. Problem that why is women's safety such a big issue these days and what problems are happening in that area, right? So that can also be a research problem. And what is the purpose of a research problem? To identify if there is any gap or if there is any difficulty that needs you to intervene and solve things. That is the research problem. After you have identified what is the problem, then you are going to form the hypothesis. And we know what is the hypothesis. Hypothesis is a tentative statement that the researcher frames, and this statement guides the entire research process. Along with being tentative, it is also a logically reasoned statement that predicts the relationship between two or more variables. It's like a provisional answer, and we are later supposed to test it. So, why is it called tentative? Why is it called provisional? Because right now we have not tested it. We have just created it in the beginning, and when we collect data, when we perform the analysis, then only we will know that should we reject our hypothesis or should we fail to reject it. So the decision will be made only at the end, which is why it's always called tentative. It's always called provisional. And it always gives you the relationship between all of your variables. So to give you an example, if I say that um, so when you start framing a hypothesis, you always start by framing the null hypothesis. So if I say that CBT intervention will have no impact on anxiety. So you have created a statement and then you are going to conduct the experiment and then you will figure out if you should reject it or you should fail to reject it. I'll write this statement also so that we'll understand the characteristics of hypothesis in context of the statement. So CBT intervention will have no impact on anxiety. We always start by framing the null hypothesis only. This is the one that is tested. So what are the characteristics of a good hypothesis? Firstly, agreement with facts, which means that it should align with observed facts and existing knowledge. So these points are very basic, they're self-explanatory, so I'll be going over them fast. Consistency with natural laws. So there are some universal laws, right? For example, this is right direction, this is left direction, and sun comes in the morning, then it's the moon that we see at the night, right? The basic body temperature at rest is 98.6. These are very basic, universally stated facts. Your hypothesis cannot go against it. It has to be in support of that only. Simplicity, that it should be simply stated. It should be very clearly written. It shouldn't be very complex or ambiguous. Testability, as in whatever you are stating, it should be easily testable. It should be easily verifiable, and it shouldn't be very complex in the fact कि आपने जो लिखा है आप वो टेस्ट नहीं कर पा रहे हो. Logical reasoning, that it should allow you to do deductive reasoning and it should allow you to test, it should be testable basically. Clarity of variables, that your variable should be very clearly written. So here my variables are CBT intervention and anxiety. It has to be very clearly written in the hypothesis itself. And lastly, feasibility, that it should be possible for you practically to implement it. This is something that I can easily implement. I can bring a therapist on people who are experiencing anxiety. I can give them therapy. It is very easily possible. It's not something that involves a lot of rocket science. This is very practically feasible. Now we move on to the different types of hypothesis. So we mainly have two types of hypothesis known as the null hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis. As I said, we always start by stating the null hypothesis. Null hypothesis is always denoted as HO, and null as in no, as in zero. It is something that always states that no relationship exists between variables. So when I framed my null hypothesis here, CBT intervention will have no impact on anxiety. So I'm saying there is no difference, there is no relationship. So when the statement is framed like that, it is always the null hypothesis. There is no significant relationship or difference between the variables. It is always used for statistical testing. And an example here is that there is no significant difference in academic performance between males and females. But on the other hand, along with the null hypothesis, we also have to frame an opposing hypothesis known as the alternative hypothesis, which is denoted by H1 or HA. It's the exact opposite of that. So if the null hypothesis says no difference, no relationship, then the alternate hypothesis has to say, hey, wait, there is a difference. There is a relationship. All right. So if you reframe the previous statement, it will be there is a significant difference in academic performance between males and females. All right. So whenever there is no difference, no relationship, that's null. And whenever there is yes, significant relationship and difference, it is the alternate hypothesis. Now, alternate hypothesis can further be divided into two more types of hypothesis, which is also called the directional hypothesis or the non-directional hypothesis. And the other name for the same is your one-tail test and your two-tail test. So one-tail test sort of looks like this, and two-tail test looks like this. One-tail test can also look like this if the area is shaded on another side of the tail. So this is one-tailed and this is two-tailed. So what is the difference between one-tail test and two-tail test? If you just look at the diagram that I have drawn just right now, let's focus on this one. Let's focus on this one and this one. We can very clearly see that only one side of the graph has been shaded, and that side which has been shaded tells us the direction. So in this one, the right side has been shaded, and in this one, the left side has been shaded. So this is very clearly telling us that this is the direction. But in the second diagram that I've drawn here, both the left side and the right side have been shaded, so it makes it very unclear as to in which side the direction is going to be. So let me explain the meaning to you now conceptually with the help of an example. So when we already know that both the variables are going to have a relationship in one particular specified direction, then a directional hypothesis or a one-tail test is used. For example, if I say that exercising daily will lead to good health and fitness. So do you think in this, the way how it has been framed, is the direction specified or not? Yes or no? Let me repeat my statement. Exercising daily will lead to good health and fitness. Exercising daily will improve your overall fitness. Yes. So when the direction has already been specified, then we are going to use a one-tail test or a directional hypothesis. Okay. But on the other hand, there will be times where you don't have enough information and you don't really know as to what kind of effect one variable is going to have on the other. All you know is that there is going to be an effect, but you do not know in which direction the effect is going to be happening. So when I say that taking one shot of COVID vaccine is going to have an impact on your health, we don't know whether the impact is going to be positive impact or whether it is going to be a negative impact. So in this one, which one will we use? Will we use one-tail test or will we use two-tail test? Yes, I hope you have understood this. I will give one more example, then we'll move on to the next topic. So if I say that greater caffeine consumption will lead to better focus. You can just write one or two in the chat box. Greater caffeine intake will lead to better focus. Okay. The use of the drug ABC will have an impact on your sleep. Yes, because here I'm just saying the word impact. Now, impact can mean anything. Maybe you will have headache at night, maybe you will wake up in the night, or maybe you'll have very deep sleep. Who knows? We don't know. All right, so it sounds like you've understood the difference correctly. In PPT, it's the previous PPT we shared, it's given in a lot of detail, so go through that also. Directional hypothesis predicts the specific direction of the relationship. We very nicely know that variable 1 is going to cause a change in variable 2 in this direction. Okay. And non-directional, all we know is there is a relationship, but we don't know in which direction it is going to exist. All right. So that is about types of hypothesis. Now, next concept here is hypothesis testing, but I will be teaching this to you in more detail when we are doing the statistical tests. Then along with that, I'll teach this so it will make more sense. Right now, it can be a little confusing, so we'll come back to it later. So we have the errors in hypothesis testing here, and let's take some examples. Okay. So I want you to focus on this table that has been drawn here. So we always start by testing the null hypothesis. As I said, we are seeing this in context with the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis can be true or the null hypothesis can be false. Tell me, if the null hypothesis is true, should it be accepted? Yes or no? If the null hypothesis is true, should it be accepted? And this is just for conceptual understanding. In stats, we don't really use the word accepting. We use fail to reject, but right now, just to make it simple for you, that's why I'm using the word accepting. Okay. So if the null hypothesis is true, then we should accept it. And if we do actually end up accepting it, then that would be correct decision that we are making. But let's say the poor null hypothesis was true and you should have accepted it, but by mistake, you rejected it. It was true, but you still rejected it. So that is known as type 1 error. The probability of committing a type 1 error is also called alpha. So it's also called alpha error. And that's why we say that type 1 error occurs when you reject a null hypothesis that was true and it should not have been rejected. And another thing about type 1 error is that it is also known as the false positive. Type 1 error, denoted by alpha, is also called false positive. It represents the probability of rejecting null hypothesis when it is true and you should not have rejected it. Only pointer you need to know here is that it is controlled by the level of significance. On the other hand, let's focus now on the fact that the null hypothesis can be false also. So if the null hypothesis is false, should you accept it or should you reject it? Yes, then you should reject it. So if you are rejecting a false null hypothesis, you are making a correct decision as you should. But by mistake, it was false and you should have rejected it. But instead of rejecting, you failed to reject. You accepted it. You failed to reject an incorrect null hypothesis. Then that is known as type 2 error and it is also represented by beta. So type 2 error, denoted by beta, is also known as false negative, and it represents the probability of accepting or failing to reject a null hypothesis when it is false. All right. So in the PPT, I have given a very nice example of a man and a lady who is pregnant. There's a pregnancy test example happening. If you read it, you will understand it in a lot of depth. And if you are someone who has already read that example, then I'm sure you must have understood it. All right. So when you usually ask which type of error is more dangerous, then we conclude the type 1 error is more serious or it is more dangerous, because in this you are rejecting a true hypothesis. And in this process, you are making a lot of false claims and a lot of wrong conclusions that shouldn't have been there. Please comment yes in the chat box if you can see it. Okay, great. So let's continue. I was explaining all of these types of errors to you. We have gone over type 1 and type 2 error. Now, obviously, errors in any research are not good, and our focus is to reduce the errors as much as possible. There are some ways through which you can reduce errors for yourself. So, one of the most simplest measures is to increase your sample size, right? So that you can reduce both type 1 and type 2 error. Now, with lesser sample size, it's often difficult to generalize your study, and lesser sample size are very homogeneous also in nature. So it's hard to make generalizations, and along with that, it also just brings a lot of error in general. So the more sample size that you have, the less error is there. Then they also say that the kind of tests that you're using, they should be very powerful. And thirdly, choosing an appropriate significance level. So as I told you in the previous slide, that significance level is something that we do when we are doing the statistical tests. So then it will make more sense to you. But for now, these three control measures are there: big sample size, using powerful tests, and setting your level of significance to either 1% or 5%, depending upon what your research is about. It varies from research to research. All right. So after this, we have the next topic called scales of measurement. And if you are with me, if you are with the correct pace of the class, then please do a thumbs up. And if you are getting any questions in between, please keep putting them in the chat box. If you're ready to start with the next topic, scales of measurement, please do a thumbs up. Okay. Can you explain type 2 error again? I'll explain when we are ending the class. For now, let me just complete the slides. So we are here at scales of measurement. All right. So basically, there are 4 scales of measurement, which are also known as 4 levels of measurement. And these help us identify that which variable should be having which level of measurement. On the basis of that only we can measure it. On the basis of that only we can identify which statistical test to use, which operation to make. There are 4: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And nominal and ordinal can be types of categorical variables which are much qualitative in nature, whereas interval and ratio can be classified under the numerical variables which are more quantitative in nature. Now let's understand one by one what each of these variables mean and what are they trying to say. So at a very basic level, at a very foundational level, at the very simplest level, there will be some variables in your environment, very qualitative in nature, such as mango, banana, orange, apple, pear, watermelon. So what are these types of? Can you tell me in the chat box? Yes, these are types of fruits, right? Now, what are we doing here? Apple, mango, banana, orange, all of these are objects which have some similar shared characteristics, and we are trying to group it together. We are trying to categorize it together depending upon what common shared quality it has. Similarly, if I say B positive, B negative, AB positive, O positive, A negative, then all of that is what? All of those are your blood groups. Right? So again, we are trying to categorize it together. So in this categorization, as you can see, there is no quantity, there is no order. We are not saying one fruit is better than the other, or we are not establishing a rank between the blood groups also. It is just in the form of quality. So nominal scale is the simplest form of measurement. There are qualities in there, no quantity, no order, and only labels are used just for the purpose of identification or classification, like fruits, blood groups, gender, etc. Gender is an example, right? Now, what kind of statistical test can be used along with nominal scales? The chi-square, because chi-square can work with categorical data. We'll go chi-square later in detail. And only mode can be used in the nominal scale. Why? Because you cannot calculate the mean of fruits, right? You cannot calculate the mean of apple, banana, orange. You cannot calculate the median of apple, banana, orange because they are very qualitative in nature. They are not quantitative values, right? There is no order or distance because, of course, these are qualitative values. But on the other hand, if we move ahead to the second level of measurement, which is known as the ordinal scale has all the qualities of the nominal scale, but along with that, it introduces another concept known as the order or ranks. For example, if we talk about your 10 plus 2, then we talk about bachelor's, then master's, then PhD, then post PhD. So all of these are your educational ranks, and you will notice that there is a lot of unequal distance or unequal gaps between all of these degrees. So class 12, 10 plus 2 is of 12 years. Then bachelor's is of 3 years. Master's is of 2 years. PhD is of 5 years. So the gap between all of them is quite uneven. The gap is not equal. The gap is not the same. So that is known as your ordinal scale when there is a rank, but the distance and the gap between the rank is unequal and it is not the same. Another example that I'll give you here is that let's say in a class, the PTM is there and teacher is congratulating those who have gotten the first rank, the second rank, and the third rank. So the student who has got the first rank, his marks are 99 out of 100. Then the one who is second in class, his marks are 90 to 100. And the one who's come third, his marks are 91.5. So the limitation of ordinal scale is that it will only tell you who is first, second, and third, but it will not tell you how many marks they have scored, right? We have no information that there is only 0.5 marks of gap between the second and the third achiever. So no information about what the marks are, how many distance or the gap between all of the marks. All we know is that okay, this is rank, but how much distance between the ranks, we don't know anything. All right, so median and percentile can be used here. So I think that's all you need to know about ordinal ranks. Next, moving on to interval ranks. So interval has all the qualities of the ordinal scale, but one thing that is covered up in the form of limitation in the interval scale is that now in interval scale, the gap is quite equal and the gap is very uniform. So if you talk about the temperature, the thermometer is somewhat like this. The values in the thermometer are very equal. So this will be 100, this will be 101, this will be 102, this will be 103, this will be 104, and so on. So you see that the gap between each of the intervals is the same. The gap is equal, right? So this limitation, which was there in ordinal scale previously, it has been covered up here. And a good quality about interval scale is that it has equal intervals between the values. And that allows for very easy comparison. So my temperature is 100, my friend's temperature is 102, so we can easily compare. There's a difference of 2 degrees. So hers is greater fever. So example of interval scale, let me give you example of ordinal scale first. So if you talk about the army ranks, if you talk about the educational ranks, all of that will be ordinal. Talking about the interval scale, some examples can be your temperature, Celsius and Fahrenheit. And another quality about interval scale is that it lacks a true 0 point. What does lacking a true 0 point mean? That even if 0 is coming on the thermometer, does that mean that the temperature has vanished and disappeared and gone away? Yes or no? Tell me. If the temperature on the equipment, the thermometer is coming 0, does it mean that temperature has gone away? No, it doesn't mean that the temperature has gone away. It just means that it's very cold, right? So lack of a true 0 point means that even if it's 0, that does not mean the absence of the variable being studied. The variable still exists. All right. So that's why temperature always is an example of interval scale. But the final and the fourth level of measurement, which is the ratio scale, here there is a true and a very meaningful 0 point. So if your answer is coming 0, that means absence of the characteristic being studied. So if I say income, if someone's income is 0, is it actually possible for income to be 0? Yes or no? Is it possible for income to be 0? Yes. So a 1-year-old child who is unemployed and doesn't do any work, their income is going to be 0 only. So when I'm saying something is 0 and that actually means absence of that quality being measured, then it is ratio scale. That's why your income will always be example of ratio scale only. Next, if I say weight, haven't you seen the weighing scale, the weighing machine? By default, it is pointing towards 0 only. When nothing is kept at the weighing machine or nobody is standing on it, then only it is 0 only, right? So that means absence of any weight being measured. 0 means there is no weight, right? Reaction time as well, height as well. So all of these are qualities of your ratio scale. Height, why? Because the device, the equipment which is used for measuring height, if nobody is standing there, then at the ground, at the baseline, there is 0 height at the baseline when nobody is standing. So ratio scale is the best type of scale. It's the highest and the most precise one. It has equal intervals and a true 0 point. Usually students get confused between the interval and the ratio scale only. So that's why I will highlight it. The main difference is the true 0.1. In interval scale, 0 doesn't mean absence of the quality being measured, but in ratio scale, 0 does mean a real and a meaningful absence of the quality being measured. And rest, other qualities being the nominal scale is for categorization and classification. It's very qualitative. Ordinal scale has orders and ranks, but the distance is unequal or unknown. And interval scale has equal intervals and the rest of the traits we have measured. So the second table, I can say that the second column in this table is a little extra. Only examples are important from this, but rest of the qualities are a little extra. The ones that I am highlighting with yellow, that's the main key point. It has to be done. This is also important, that this is qualitative and categorical. This is also important. Okay. So should we go to the next topic or sampling? You can do a thumbs up if you're ready to go to sampling. Okay, let's move on to sampling now. Okay. So what is sampling and why is sampling done? To understand that, we have to first understand what is the population and what is the sample. So let's say that there is a very important international meeting happening in our country, and we have been asked by the UN that you need to bring some representatives of your country and send them to America so that the conference can happen. Is my voice breaking for everybody? Or is it fine?
No,
Is it understandable?
it's fine.
Okay. So, Kanchi, you can check your network maybe if it's fine for everybody. Okay. So, my example was that there is an important international meeting happening, and the government has asked that you need to, get your representatives from every state of India so that they can be sent for that conference abroad. So, what's the population of India? The population of India is 1 billion something. Is it possible for us to take in every single person along with us? It's not, because the flight tickets will be so expensive and it's just not practical or feasible for everybody to be available at the same time, right? Not everybody will be qualified also to be a member. So, what do we do? For the purpose of that, we go to every state, and then from every state, we pick out some people that we think can become representatives for us, and then those people become our sample, and these are the ones that are sent for the conference abroad. So this is the process of sampling, like from your entire population, which includes your complete set of observations, you choose certain individuals. Either the choice can be random selection or the choice may not be random selection, depending upon what your research is about. And you take those individuals and you form a smaller group known as the sample. All the statistical calculation is performed on the sample itself, and whatever the results are coming on the sample, that is generalized back to the population. So that is the process of sampling. Sampling is the process of selecting a subset of individuals, which is known as the sample, from a larger group, which is the population, so that you can obtain information about the entire population. And the purpose of that is to draw conclusions without having to study every number. So let's say that in Christ University, there are 10,000 students. You cannot obtain data from every 10,000 person, right? So you study only 500 of them, and whatever results are getting, you generalize it back to the 10,000 people. So the main goal here is to ensure that the sample is a true and an accurate representation of the population, so that generalization process can be made easier and meaningful. Okay, so that is the process of sampling. Now let's look at some important terms. So here, population, I have already explained you that this is the entire group of individuals that you want to study. Within the population, there is another subset or another more niched out or more specialized group of individuals that I can see that they form the target population. So, to give an example, let's say that I want to do a study on postpartum depression. So, my population is going to be all mothers who have recently given birth. And then my target population will be mothers who have recently given birth who have been diagnosed with postpartum depression. So, you know that target means that you're very specifically aiming only for this. You have made it more niched out, you have made it more specific. And ultimately, when you gather your sample from that population, then it forms a subset of the population on which you do your study and generalize it back to the population. All right. Now, two more key terms here. What's the difference between parameter and statistic? So, any numerical characteristic about the population is called the parameter, and any numerical characteristic about the sample is called a statistic. So, a mnemonic for remembering this is P for population, P for parameter, and S for sample, and S for statistic. So if I'm asking that, tell me what is the mean of the depression scores of mothers which are in my sample, then am I talking about the parameter or am I talking about statistic? You can write P or S in the chat box. Mean of depression scores of mothers in my sample. Yes, that is the statistic. Yes. But if I'm saying that, can you calculate and tell me how many mothers in India have given birth in the year 2025? Yes, that is the parameter because we are talking about the population here, the complete set of observations. So in the PPT, the previous PPT we've sent you, you will find a lot more concepts like target population, accessible population, but that's like a little extra. This is all that you need to know. I think this is good enough. So now let's go to types of sampling. Majorly, there are two types of sampling. One is known as probability sampling, and the other one is known as non-probability sampling. So, what is the difference between probability and non-probability sampling? One of the differences is that, firstly, in probability sampling, you are already aware of the probability that each person from the population is going to be selected to form a part of the sample later. That is probability sampling. Another quality about this being that each person has an equal known and a non-zero chance of being selected. Non-zero means that they will get selected basically at some point. There is some chance they will be selected. That chance is not the same as zero. So probability sampling is good because it is truly representative of the population. The sample so formed in probability sampling is very representative of the population because there is no bias in this type of sampling. It's very objective, it doesn't have any bias. So representation is good, and as a result of that, generalization can also be done very confidently. So I'll highlight the key points from probability sampling. Good representation, good generalization, objectivity, and every person has an equal and known chance of being selected. Now let's look at the different types of probability sampling. The first one is simple random sampling. This is, as the name suggests, it's very, very simple. So there is something known as the fishbowl method, which is used as a part of simple random sampling. So what do we do here? Let's say that your total population consists of 1,000 people, and you have to make a sample contain only 100 people. So what will you do? You will make a fishbowl and you will make chits, 1,000 chits basically, in which each person's name will be written. And then you will keep on drawing out each chit at random. And then you'll take it out and you will repeat this for 100 times. And whoever comes out to be in this process, whoever's name is coming out, that becomes a part of your sample. And when you reach the 100th chit, then you will stop and your simple random sampling is done. So a good thing about this is that there is no bias. Is voice breaking? Okay, then anytime the voice breaks, you can tell me how much is it breaking? Is it breaking to like a level that you cannot understand what I'm speaking at all? I'm actually using 5G network. So, okay, if it's understandable, then that's all right. We can continue like this because I am at 5G. Okay, if it breaks again, then you can tell me. Okay, so that is the simple random sampling method, and it's a very good method because there is no bias in this, and every person has equal chance of being selected because literally you just have to take it out from the fishbowl and then your sample is formed. Okay. Of course, now nobody makes 1,000 chits now. There are softwares for making this process easier for you. The second one is systematic sampling. So what do we do in systematic sampling? Let's say that you have 100 people in your population and you want to make a sample of 10. So you will place all those 100 people and you will start by picking any person of your choice first very randomly, and then the subsequent selections will be happening on the basis on something known as n. And this n is something that can take any random number of your choice. So very randomly, let's take 3. That's a very random selection. Randomly, I said 3. So let's say out of 100 people, I made them stand in a line and the first person that I took was the fourth participant. So all the other people that I'm going to select from the population to be a part of my sample are going to be 4 plus 3. Then the answer plus 3 plus 3 plus 3. So tell me that from the row of people who are standing, with whose number of person should I pick up next? If my n is 3, which number person should I pick up next? Then what after that? Okay, so you've already calculated it. No, actually this calculation is not right. What was our n? Anyway, we don't have to look into the calculation. All the only thing that matters is that the subsequent calculation, the subsequent selection is done on the basis of your n, whatever your n is coming. So look at this photo over here. So in this photo, looks like their n is 4, I think. So they've started by choosing the second person. Then after 4 jumps, they have selected the next person. Then again after however number of jumps it is. Yeah, so I hope you've gotten the idea here. It's not about calculation or drawing it, but it's about making you understand. So if you've understood systematic sampling, just write yes in the chat box. If your n is 2, it will be somewhat like 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Okay, great. The next type of sampling is called stratified sampling. And stratified sampling is done when there are a lot of heterogeneous people in your population. So let's take the example of a state. Let's take the example of state um, Gujarat very randomly. Let's talk about Gujarat. And there are a lot of religions in Gujarat. You will find Hindu people, you will find Muslims, you will find Christians, you will find Jains, you will find Sikhs, you will find so many religions in Gujarat. Okay, and they are very scattered. And a colony in this house, Hindu people live. Then on top of them, on other floor, Sikh people live. Then at the ground floor, Muslim people lives. Then in the next house, different religions. So it's all mixed and fragmented like that. So what will you do? The first thing that you will do is you will try to divide your population into subgroups with common characteristics. And in this case, the common characteristic would be the religion that they have, right? So the population will be divided into subgroups known as strata depending on the common religion. So we will have one group of Hindus, and other group we will have of Muslims, then other group we will have of Sikhs, then other group would be of Christians, then Jains and Buddhists and so on. So now our strata, our different groups have been created already. Now the next step is that from each strata, we have to randomly select people, as many people as we want. So let's say from there are let's say 100 Hindus. So from that, I'm randomly taking 20 Hindus. Then from Muslim group, I'm randomly taking 20 Muslims. From the other group, is my voice breaking a lot? Are you not able to understand it? Okay. Let me try to change my network then. Okay, I have changed my network now. So is it fine or is it still breaking? Okay, great. If it breaks again, then you can tell me, though I don't think it should break anymore. Okay. So do you want me to repeat anything? Because it was breaking, so you may have not been able to hear something. Do you want me to repeat anything? If yes, then you can tell me the name of the topic. Otherwise, you can say no and I'll proceed. Okay, what do you, Nayan, what do you want me to repeat? You can say that also. Okay, stratified sampling is done when your population is very heterogeneous, where there are different groups in your population. We are taking the example of religion here. We have Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Jain, Buddhists in our population. So first thing, we are going to divide these religions into small different groups known as strata. And each strata is going to have people of the same religions. So one strata of only Hindus, another strata of only Muslims, another strata of only Sikhs, another strata of only Jains, another strata of only Buddhists. Then we will pick up each strata, and from each strata we will very randomly select as many number of people as we want. Depending upon the number of people that you're selecting, stratified sampling can be of two types: proportionate stratified sampling and disproportionate stratified sampling. What happens in proportionate stratified sampling? The idea here is that the number of people that you're taking from one strata to make your sample should be very proportionate. So that means if there are more number of Hindus in the strata, you need to take more number of Hindus in the sample. And if there are less number of Muslims in the strata, then you need to take less number of Muslims in the sample so that the representation can be quite fair. All right. Because again, if you take the example of how seats are allocated in the parliament, also in the Lok Sabha, the Rajya Sabha, it is done on the basis of the population size of different states, right? So Uttar Pradesh has the highest number of vacancies and the constituencies for the members of parliament because the population of Uttar Pradesh is so big. So I think there are some 10, 12, whatever number of people which go from UP because the population of UP is very big. Similarly, only one constituency from Goa because Goa anyway has very less population. So when the sampling is done in a proportionate manner, that the bigger the strata, the more people will go in the sample, and the smaller the strata, the less people will go in the sample. That is known as proportionate stratified sampling. But on the other hand, disproportionate is when it is not done on the basis of proportions. It is just done on the basis of that I want 10 people from every group. I don't care how many people are there in the strata. I just want 10 people from every group. That has a risk sometimes of unequal representation. So that's about it. And there are two types: stratified में, proportionate and disproportionate. Next, we move on to cluster sampling. And in cluster sampling, it is also known as area sampling. Here we work with geographical locations and areas. So let's say that you have, let's take the Gujarat state only. Let's say that this is Gujarat. This is the map of Gujarat. So this will be north, this will be south, this will be east, this will be west, and this will be central Gujarat. So I'm sure there must be a lot of provinces, there must be a lot of um what can I call areas under Gujarat, like let's call it provinces only for better understanding. These are different provinces in Gujarat. All right. This is the map of Gujarat, and these are different provinces in Gujarat. Now I am going to categorize all of these provinces on the basis of their locations. So all the eastern provinces will come under this cluster, all the northern provinces will come under this cluster, all the central provinces will come under this cluster, all the western provinces under this western cluster, and all the southern provinces will come under the southern cluster. Like there will be a lot of clusters basically. Now my process of cluster sampling will involve me to randomly pick up as many number of clusters as I want. All right. So let's say that from Eastern cluster, I've taken this cluster, from Western, I've taken this cluster, from Northern, I've taken this cluster, and from Southern, I've taken this cluster. In the PPT that we have shared with you, I've created an entire map of Delhi in which it is, represented very visually. I've written the entire instructions down. It's done very nicely. So that's why I said that if you look at the PPT beforehand, then only you will get a understanding of what's happening in class. Otherwise, it may not be very easily understandable to you in the first time. So that's about cluster sampling. So people often have this confusion. Let me clear it out. In stratified sampling, first we will convert the entire population into strata, and from each strata we will select few individuals. But in cluster sampling, we are dividing our area into different clusters, and instead of taking few people from each clusters, we are just taking random clusters of our own choice. So that is cluster sampling, and I believe it's the most simplified explanation. If you see the PPT, then you will understand better. So this Gujarat was just an example to explain it to you because we were previously talking about Gujarat only. That's why Gujarat came into mind. But for better understanding purposes, you can also think of the map of India. India is such a large country. It has states in northern India, it has states in western India, it has states in eastern area India, and states in the southern area also. So now imagine the map of India, and let's say that from southern India, you decide to only take Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, and you leave out Kerala, you leave out Andhra Pradesh or other places. You've just decided कि ठीक है, the states are there, the clusters are there, but I only want to take Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, and it's a very random process. Then from North India, very randomly you only take J&K and you take Punjab. Then from Central India, you very randomly take MP and Chhattisgarh. So the selection of clusters, the selection of states is done very randomly. That's why cluster sampling comes under random sampling. Okay, so that is all about types of probability sampling that you need to know. Should we move on to non-probability sampling? Yes, in the chat box, or no in the chat box. Okay, great. There are only 3 yeses. Okay, great. Now let's move to non-probability sampling, and this will be the last topic of today's class. So in non-probability, firstly, we don't know what is the probability that this person from the population is going to be taken to form a part of the sample. That is unknown. Secondly, not every person has an equal chance of being selected. Along with that, we may not know every person in the population. So not every individual in the population has a known or equal chance of being selected. And what defines your selection process? Either it is your convenience or the accessibility or your judgment. So here the sample is not formed for generalization purposes because it is not really representative of the population, but rather it is formed to just understand the depth and the personal experiences of people. And sometimes it is done when it is not possible for the person to spend too much time and money, right? So it's more practical and economical also. So let's see the 4 types of it: convenience, purposive, quota, and snowball sampling. So convenience sampling, I'll give you an example. So let's say that you have some questionnaires and you want to get responses of participants. So you go to a mall and you are standing at the entry gate of the mall and you decide that whoever comes in front of me, I will hand them the pamphlet and they will have to fill it. So here, who is filling your form? Whoever is in close physical proximity to you, whoever is willing to fill your form and doesn't tear it out of anger and throw it away, whoever is accessible to you. So, isn't this type of sampling happening on the basis of what is convenient to you as a researcher? So, when the researcher's convenience is kept in mind, when the participants that are in your sample are very physically close to you. Physical proximity is there. Participants are accessible. Participants are available and willing to be a part of your sample. That is known as convenient sampling. Why? Because it is convenient to you. It is also called incidental sampling because all those people who are a part of your sample, they incidentally happen to be there at the venue at the same time as you. Also called haphazard sampling because you see that it's done very quickly and it is not very representative. That's why haphazard sampling. So the keywords here are easy, accessible, availability, willingness, physical proximity, quick but less representation. Next one is purposive sampling. So there are times where you want your sample to be very specific, you want it to be very niched out, and you only want to particularly study a certain group of people, or you want to study some experts who have some subject matter related knowledge about a topic. So let's say that if I want to understand the if I want to obtain data from army veterans, or if I want to obtain data from cancer survivors, or if I want to obtain data from people who have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, or if I want to get data from mothers who have recently given birth, or people who have moved in with their in-laws who've recently been married, right? So this kind of information only these people can give me, and the general lay population cannot give me. I cannot ask a general lay person how it feels like to be in the army because they will not know. Only an army veteran can tell me that. So this population is very niched out, it is very specific. So I am very deliberately choosing those people only. I'm very deliberately, very intentionally selecting those people only. So that's why it is called purposive sampling, because your sampling is very purposive in nature. Purposive as in you are doing it purposely. You are purposely choosing this person intentionally because they have the qualities that you need in your sample. So when you intentionally select individuals who possess specific characteristics or knowledge that you particularly need, that is purposive sampling. Next is quota sampling. So what happens in quotas is that there is a predetermined and a predefined number of people that you should be getting in different categories of your sample. So let's say that I have to do research on people who are in relationships. So I will be having different categories, right? One category will be people that have just started dating a month back, or people who have been dating long term for like 5, 6, 7 years, or people who have now become married after many years of dating, people who have been married for 10 years, maybe people who have separated, people who have divorced, people whose partners are no more. So these are so many categories. Now, quota sampling is used when you already know how many people you need in each category. So, my supervisor has told me, go and get 20 people who have just started dating, go and get 50 people who have been dating from the past 5 years, go and get 20 people who have been dating from the past 10 years, go and get 40 people who have recently been married after many years of dating, go and get 10 people who have divorced, 10 people who have separated, all of that. So, here we already have predetermined categories, we already have the knowledge of how many people we want in each category. So once that knowledge has been made, then we will go out and we will very conveniently follow the process of convenient sampling, and whoever comes in front of us, we'll ask them, are you in a relationship? Are you married? Are you divorced? And whoever says yes, whoever is willing to participate, then on the basis of that, we will perform convenient sampling. All right, so that's the meaning of quota sampling. So what happens in quota sampling? First, you have predetermined number, you have a predetermined or you have a fixed number, and then along with that you follow it with convenience sampling. That's your quota sampling. And lastly, the last one is snowball sampling. So this is used when you need the sample, but sometimes it is out of your reach. It is hard to reach that sample. The sample is somewhat, the population is somewhat a little hidden, right? So what do? You start by getting two, three people, and then you ask those two, three people only that can you please ask within your community, can you please ask within your contacts to come and participate in my research, with the assumption that if they belong to the same community, then they of course would be knowing others from the same community as well. For example, um, transgenders, it's if it's not very simple to access them and ask them to be a part of their study, then maybe you will ask one or two and you'll ask them to refer it to others also in their community. Or maybe people who are into gambling, like nobody on the road will tell you, hi, I'm a gambler, please take me in your study, right? You have to ask them, do you know more people? Then they will refer you. So people who are alcoholics, people who are into gambling, transgenders, people from the LGBTQIA community, right? So these people, you will start by identifying one or two and then you'll ask others to refer. So just like a snowball is very small in the beginning, but then you run it through the slope of a mountain and it collects more and more snow and it becomes bigger. That's how the name of snowball sampling has come up. It's also called referral sampling, network sampling, or chain sampling. So existing participants refer new participants who meet the study criteria. Useful when the population is hard to reach or hidden. All right, so that is it about the types of sampling. And with this, we are done with the portion for today's class. I thought that we will complete 10 slides in every class. So in 3 days, we can complete stats. So this was our first class and I'm also experimenting with the pace. So I want to hear from you, how was the pace like? You can rate it from 1 to 10. 1 means, is my camera off? I didn't know that. Okay. So let's understand how to rate it basically. 1 is very slow, very boring, oh my god. And 2 and 10. 10 is very fast, everything is going above my head, I cannot understand anything. And 5 is like the sweet spot, that this is good, we can follow with this. So if you are below 5, you think that it is a little slow and it can be faster. And if you're above 5, you want me to go slower. So the ones who are finding it fast, I wonder if you have seen the presentation pehle se or not, because that's why I was saying in the beginning, right? You need to look at the presentation, then only you will understand what is being taught. Otherwise, it will all be very new to you, right? So the ones who have previously seen the presentation, I'm sure they must have understood better, and for them it would be some sort of revision only. But for those who are seeing it, who are gonna see it after class, you will have to spend more time in linking the concepts what you studied today. Okay, great. So I will be following this pace only, and there is no way that I can go slower because we have to complete the entire syllabus in 30 days. So I would like for you all to support me by reviewing the material before the classes so that you don't feel lost. So are there any questions from today before we close? Can you explain confounding variable once again? Kirti, are you a full course student or have you only enrolled for the crash course? Okay, then if you're the full course student, then you should go and watch the recording, right? Everything has been explained. I've spent so much time explaining all of these concepts. Please go. Everything is already available to you. We are very short on time, so I don't want to be repeating the concepts that I've already explained in a lot of depth. We want to do new topics. So please watch that video. And if you still don't understand, then you can ask me later. It is there in the PPT also. All examples, everything has been given. So please watch that first. Will the shorter PPT be available? Yes. Could you please explain how mediating and moderating variable? Basically, mediating is also called intervening variable. It tells you how IV is going to have an impact on DV. So an example which is there in the PPT as well, let's say IV is poverty and um, shorter longevity is your DV. So does poverty cause shorter longevity? Yes. And what comes between them? Maybe lack of accessible healthcare. So, see, lack of accessible healthcare explains how IV is relating to and causing a change in DV. That is your mediating variable. Moderating variable, on the other hand, is something again that comes between the IV and DV. Let's say IV is your stress and DV is anxiety. And we saw in the class example, social support is coming in between. If social support is more, then your anxiety is going to be less. If social support is less, then anxiety will be more. Stress induced anxiety is going to be more if social support is less. So moderation is like less or more. The more or the less the moderating variable is, similarly, the impact of IV becomes intensified or reduced on the DV. If you read your books, if you find more examples, you'll get more clarity on this. Where will this PPT be available on the portal? Shorter PPT will be available for full course students. Okay. Few doubts regarding Christ University entrance you can ask on the WhatsApp group. All right. So before we end the class, can you rate your level of understanding from 1 to 10 of today's class in terms of how well you understood the topics? Okay, 9, 10. Nice to see that. So please revise this. And if you are very worried about how will I complete my syllabus, don't worry. We are having classes every day for 1.5 hours. Just attend those classes. Your syllabus will be done as much as is needed, and the best we can do, we will do in the 30 days. All right. But for that, you need to review the PPTs beforehand. You need to understand what is being taught in class and revise after that. इतना तो आपको करना पड़ेगा because आपको entrance देना है. Mocks, uh, we will be giving mocks, and we will send more details about the process and the number of mocks and all that. Okay. So thanks for joining. And if there are any questions related to the course or the entrance, you can put it on the WhatsApp group. And we will meet tomorrow, same time, 5 p.m., where we'll continue with stats. You will get all the material PPT recording on the portal. So I will see you all tomorrow, and take care. Good night. All the best. Bye. Welcome.